We should be live now. I'm a mustachioed version of Josh Gold, and I'm on the board of the Canadian International Council. I'm just looking at our participants. I'm gonna wait for a few more to come in and start at 12:10 as we agreed in our email. People seem to be piling in now. And once that number steadies out, then I will begin some introductory remarks and introduce our panelists for today. And I'll reiterate this in my remarks soon and throughout this webinar, but to all audience members, please do feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit questions. I will be looking at this, and I believe our panelists will also be able to see these and answer we'll answer your questions, or at least try to, in the question and answer period at the end of the talk. So we'll just give it 30 more seconds or so and begin shortly. All right, so I think we're good to go. The number of participants rolling in has seemed to steady for now, and if they join us later, then so be it. But good day, good morning, and evening to everyone. As I said, I'm Josh Gold, and I'm on the board of the Canadian International Council's Toronto branch, which is one of 15 branches across the country. The CIC is an independent, non-partisan platform for citizens to engage in discussions on international issues. And our mission is to involve Canadians in defining our country's place in the world. Our main speaker today is Dr. Philip N. Howard, a professor and writer from the University of Oxford, who is also the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and is sorry, I should say Oxford University, not the University of Oxford. But he's the author most recently of Lie Machines: How to Save Democracy from Troll Armies, Deceitful Robots, Junk News Operations, and Political Operatives. Dr. Howard's new book offers behind-the-scenes stories from the world's biggest and most damagingly successful misinformation initiatives. Dr. Howard not only shows how these campaigns evolved from older propaganda operations, but also exposes their new powers, gives us insight into their effectiveness, and what I'm most looking forward to, explains how to shut them down. Joining Dr. Howard in discussion is none other than Gabrielle Lim, a researcher at the Technology and Social Change Project at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center, as well as a fellow with the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses primarily on censorship and media manipulation and their impact on civil society, freedom of expression, and security. Today's hour-long event will begin with a presentation by Dr. Howard of his book, followed by discussion with Gabby, after which I've committed to have at least 15 minutes for Q&A with our audience. And as I said earlier, feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions. 3 audiobook copies of Dr. Howard's book will also be raffled off after the event to our participants, and we'll follow up with you over email. Now, in the preface to his book, Dr. Howard writes that, and I paraphrase, but he writes that, or paraphrase, he writes that authoritarian governments will look, almost by definition, for ways to use new information technologies for social control. Democracy advocates will always look for creative ways to catch dictators off guard using information technology. What I didn't expect is that authoritarian regimes would use such techniques on voters in democracies. And then I didn't expect politicians and political parties in democracies to adapt those techniques for the use on their own citizens. Dr. Howard, I'm looking forward to hearing more. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Josh, for that kind introduction. And of course, thank you, Gabby, and members for joining for today. It's always exciting to present this research, even though it's a book, which by definition means the latest stories are from 6 months ago. There seems to be a never-ending cascade of misinformation generated by political actors around the world. So what I'd like to do is do a screen share and walk you through where the book came from and tell some stories based on the data that we've been collecting over time. But then towards the end, I could say something about the latest trends in misinformation, and perhaps say a little bit about COVID when we talk about COVID and misinformation. And I'm confident Gabby and I will have a good conversation because there's so many interesting social and technical aspects to the mechanisms that generate big political lies and make them have an impact. So the book started off, actually, the project was called Truth Machines at first. My goal was to try to write about how social media was useful for promoting understanding and civic engagement. Its title's changed. It's now Lie Machines, and I've just popped up a discount code for CIC members. If you're still interested in this topic at the end of the hour, and you can buy the book from the Yale University Publishers site with Why Lies as a discount. And I think given how much we now see about COVID misinformation, what I'd like to do is talk to you a bit about the history, the recent history of what I've come to call computational propaganda. Say a little bit about the evidence that's out there, and talk about the particular mission of our lab. So the Oxford Internet Institute is a fairly large group of 40, we have 40 faculty. The specific group, the computational propaganda group, works on applying social data science to solving collective problems, solving public problems. As a faculty, we're about a third computer scientists and a third social scientists and a third humanists. We're in a social science division, but the group that focuses on this particular stuff is even more multidisciplinary, with people from backgrounds in physics and engineering, and I think a shared passion for calling out lies and misinformation, and trying to encourage public understanding of important political issues. Now, it's always important to declare the funding, and most of the funding at the moment comes from the European Research Council. The National Science Foundation in the US helped seed the project, and our public outreach work is supported by the Omidyar network. Now, let me start off then with the definition of what a lie machine is. A lie machine, and this is important for those of us who are social scientists, a lie machine is a social and technical mechanism for pushing some untrue claim and putting an untrue claim in the service of ideology. The reason this is important to start with is that among social scientists, I am one of the few, I think we are some of the few, who would give technology an agency role. Technology itself, I think, is a cause of some social problems. It provides capacities and constraints. And I think it doesn't make sense to talk about modern politics now without being able to tell the social story, the organization of political parties and dictatorships, and the technical side, being able to understand algorithms and how they get gamed, or the affordances of mobile phones that make them useful for sharing some kinds of content and not others. So there's a social and a technical side to modern politics. And these two aspects to the mechanism produce content that's misinformation, disseminates the content, gets it into your inbox, into your social media feeds. And then there's a sort of a third chapter that involves the marketing. This is the aftermarket of PR firms, PR consulting houses that make sure that help take a story that's seems like a ridiculous half-truth and turn it into a grand myth that can last months or years in public conversation. Now, among the biggest, most successful, significant misinformation campaigns I've ever seen, it has to be among the most recent. The complex link between 5G technologies as a cause of COVID, a story, a narrative that's wrapped up in a personality, Bill Gates, who wants to inject RFID chips into our arms on behalf of the government. It's a complex narrative that involves multiple features of some myths, including the anti-vax movement, which has lasted for years. This is one of the grandest stories I've ever seen, connecting multiple myths through, as I mentioned, the stories of personality and multiple platforms of misinformation in a complex web of half-truths and dangerous truths, right, for public health. When we started doing this kind of work 5 years ago, we often started with Twitter data feeds because that was the most accessible. This was one of the first accounts we tracked. The bear might give it away. It's one of the early Russian accounts that would occasionally tweet in Cyrillic. That's how we caught it. And then it would move back to working in English, talking about politics in the 2020 election. Then for several years, whenever we wanted to start a fresh scoop of bots, we would start with Trump's follower list. And I don't mean this as a political dig. I mean this as a methodology point. He has so many bots, fake accounts following him, that it's a good starting point whenever we need a fresh scoop of Twitter data. And if you're on Twitter, you have bots following you, right? They don't have many pictures. They have numbers for names. They rarely tweet until they wake up one day and have an agenda to push. And the real problem for public life is when the agenda involves a racist or sexist message around events that didn't occur. Here's some screen caps from a Russia Today story, an RT story a few years ago about women in hijab storming the beaches of Europe, of Greece, trying to escape their countries but ruining European vacations, or trying to flood across passport control in Morocco. Both doctored photos, both incidents that did not happen, both stories that were promoted over social media. When we do our work at Oxford, often we find that the best combination of research involves some quantitative and some qualitative methods. Last summer, one of our colleagues returned from studying a business in Poland that maintained 40,000 fake Facebook accounts. Their primary clients were not politicians. Their primary clients were pharmaceuticals firms, who would hire them, for example, to hire 10,000 Facebook accounts to have trouble managing their migraines and to tell the stories of the difficult life with migraines in a public setting. And then they would hire 10,000 other Facebook accounts to have a new medicine for managing their migraines. And these accounts would have interactions in public and get the message out about the new product from pharmaceuticals firms. The process of producing misinformation, I think, has been innovative. Well, the innovation here is from industry, but it's political figures that take these innovations and apply them in savvy ways. What I'd like to do next is walk through some of the data that we played with working for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in the United States. This was a unique data set that the firms turned over to the Senate. It's the only collection of firm-verified known Russian accounts. So this was some 3,500 accounts, clearly managed from St. Petersburg, according to Facebook. It was data from Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter, Instagram. And what I've set out here is a simple day-to-day traffic, the traffic rhythm from the known Russian accounts managed from St. Petersburg. And I'll just offer a couple of observations. The first obvious one is that bursts of Russian activity in the 2016 election occurred on the logical days in which there was lively political action. The night of the DNC and the RNC, when Clinton and Trump debated, each night, flurries of Russian activity. Election night. Russian activity peaks whenever there's a logical event in the electoral calendar. The second punchline, I think, for this graphic is that the bulk of the activity, we got the data in mid-2018. The bulk of Russian activity is actually to the right of November 2016. The bulk of the Russian activity we know about happened after the election. It was almost as if they found, or they thought they were successful and decided to double down with personnel and resources. And that's when the trend line really starts to take off. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had several types of data, and here I've put up the Instagram data and the Facebook ad data for two reasons. I display the Facebook ad data as a way of suggesting that overall, political ads are not the major mode of engagement from foreign governments when they want to maneuver political opinion in a democracy. overall, the number of Facebook ads that people saw is fairly small compared to the organic content, and especially the organic content on Instagram. Now, this is important because almost everything we know about political manipulation online is from Twitter and Instagram. Is from Twitter and Facebook. But a number of, yes, particularly in the younger cohorts, are not on Facebook and not using Twitter as much. They're using Instagram. And towards the end of the data cycle that we saw from these Russian accounts, we found much less Facebook activity compared to the Instagram activity. Now, this is important because Instagram doesn't share any data. These few firms very rarely share any data at all. Instagram really is locked down. It's mostly visual misinformation, we think, but we have no sight of what goes on Instagram. Of course, I love my colleagues, but none of us are studying Snapchat. We have an interesting Tinder story I can tell later if you like. But for the most part, the platforms, we know there's politics on all platforms, but researchers only have access, barely access, to Facebook and Twitter. Now, the messaging in 2016 from the Russians was on polarizing issues, particularly to do with race, still a highly polarized topic in the US. It was about baiting the Black Lives Matter movement, something that still happens, I think. I'm confident. There were hot button issues related to gun control and abortion, issues that are polarizing in the US context. And later, by 2018, much of the cultural messaging had moved from Black Lives Matter onto Hispanic and Mexican American cultural issues. And these kinds of issues, these kinds of cultural messaging about voter disenfranchisement. So if you're Latina or you're African American, no white politician will represent you. Don't even bother to vote. There were voter suppression tactics designed to encourage people to express themselves in ways other than voting. Now, in the last year or two, this has become a global phenomenon. Each summer, the team here at Oxford does an inventory of the number of countries where we can detect misinformation campaigns. In 2017, there were 28 countries with these kinds of organized misinformation campaigns. And that's the key word here. These are not lone wolf operations. These are operations with budgets and job ads and hiring plans and performance bonuses and secretaries and phone banks. These are significant organizations. In 2018, the number grew again. By 2019, last summer, there were 70 countries. In authoritarian regimes, these tend to be military units. They get retasked to pushing social media. But in democracies, it's PR agencies, it's regular PR firms and consulting companies that work for the political parties, using the same kinds of techniques. One of the things that's changed really since the book was written is that there are more and more countries emulating what the Russians do. India, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi, Venezuela, all now have mini IRAs, Internet Research Agencies. And in fact, some of them have sent staff to Moscow for training on how to use social media. This is a straightforward graphic from one of the great pieces of research that BuzzFeed has done, tracking down the information operations that are actually just attributed to PR agencies. And more of them over time seem to have their origins here in the West. It's not just about state-backed misinformation. For the last 6-8 weeks, we've been producing a weekly memo on COVID misinformation. And one of the interesting things we found is that for the most part, the BBC, the CNN, CBC, when we studied it, reach a significant number of users, social media users. And this is a simple count of all Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook accounts that are getting content from the BBC. So the average news source can reach quite a few people, but between them, Russia Today and Sputnik, CGTN, a series of Chinese-backed media outlets, can reach almost 1 billion social media users each week with their content. And junk health news sources, so these are they're not fake news, they're fake health news sources, reach at least 250 million social media users a week with their content. Now, as you might expect, the content that comes out of professional news agencies gets some engagement on social media, but the junk stuff and the state-backed stuff gets much more engagement. It has some significantly higher rates of engagement. I'm going to start to wrap up, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with Gabby about these big picture trends and what she's seeing. I think if I were to look ahead, I'd offer a couple of observations about what the threats to democracy really are. I think it's safe to say that every national security crisis, every budget bill, every tax bill, every health complex humanitarian disaster will come with some kind of automated campaign for it or against it, or blaming political Islam or blaming immigrants. There will be some kind of automated process behind each major political issue that we face in the years ahead. I think China has really arrived in the last 18 months, last 9 months, actually, I'd say, since Hong Kong. Hong Kong was the moment with a protest, the most recent rounds of democracy protests there. That was a moment where China displayed that they actually do care about what social media users working in English think about what goes on in Hong Kong. And that's when China began to launch its massive campaign of information operations around what's going on in Hong Kong, and then eventually the COVID crisis. I think we're going to see more and more of these kinds of techniques applied to special issues by lobbyists. I don't believe we've seen artificial intelligence behind the big campaign so far, but I think we will, right? If a lobbyist can figure out how to produce a face that you'll respond to using behavioral data from your refrigerator or from your credit card records, can hone a message based on content you've contributed on social media, they'll figure out how to do that. So I do think it's on the horizon. And then the most existential threat, I think, is in the way these kinds of campaigns undermine science and the role of expertise. So many of the campaigns for misinformation are about encouraging us to question expertise and look for the deep secrets or the dark conspiracy, when a lot of times there are no conspiracies, and there are truths, and there is scientific evidence that is worth talking about. I think the deep threat to democracy is actually in undermining the role of evidence in public policy making. Now, I have one strategy I want to highlight. I'll just move quickly here. One strategy for dealing with all this stuff. This is a strategy I ripped from the Blood Diamonds campaign. As you may remember, the innovation around the Blood Diamonds campaign is that if you could advertise to diamond consumers the full provenance of a diamond and identify which diamonds came from the nastiest pits of Africa where slaves had pulled it from the stones, from the ground, most consumers would not buy those diamonds. It's called the Kimberley process. And I think the same kind of thing could be applied to the devices we put in our households. I think we should be able to look at any device that we have in our household and ask it to tell us who the ultimate beneficiaries are of the data, which organizations are playing with the data, which third parties have been licensed access to the data. And right now, our devices can't even do that. But if we could raise that expectation and build devices that can report on who's using the data that they collect, I think the next step follows from there. Eventually, it would be good to be able to add organizations to the list of potential beneficiaries. It should be possible for us as citizens perhaps to exclude organizations, because I think this flow of data is the means of expressing ourselves now. And most of the best data about public life is not in public hands. It's in Silicon Valley. So I'll just end with this quick joke. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. I think we found it bleak and depressing to do this work over time, and it was tough to write a book that's full of stories about democratic malaise. But as a declaration of faith, I do think it's worth pursuing the truth. I do think it's worth calling out social media platforms and reminding them of their responsibilities, because correct answers do improve the quality of public life. I think COVID is showing us that misinformation itself is deadly, right? When people believe the wrong things and don't follow good advice and threaten themselves and others. So I'll stop the screen share there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and taking questions and hearing about what you all think.
Oh, that was great. Okay, I guess, yeah, I'll jump into some questions. Phil, awesome book. I think what I liked most about it was your recommendations at the end, because I find it is so hard to find any report or academic writing that actually gives recommendations of what to do at the end. It's often, you know, here's evidence of state-backed activity, and then it just ends there. Like, okay, well, what about the impact? What actually happens? What should we do? So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the mandatory reporting on ultimate beneficiaries of data, because I think, to me, that's the one that like hit my head real quick. It reminds me, you talked about the blood diamonds, but it reminds me of beneficial ownership of bank accounts and property. And there are public databases of those in Europe that are super useful for tracking down corruption, for example. Right. And it's also super helpful for countries where their own governments aren't transparent, but they can tap into these other databases to check their own government. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think I think your instinct is right. I think journalists use those databases to do original research, and academics do, and economists do. So it's not just about. I mean, it can be about persecuting political elites, or hunting down oligarchs that have stolen money, but it's also about improving public policy. I think you know, voting in a democracy is very important, but an occasional act of self-expression. I think we do much more daily self-expression with the trail of data that we leave behind. I think it's these data shadows that actually represent us. And you know, if we put contraceptives on our credit cards, then the pro-choice movement wants that data, because clearly you're pro-choice. If you've never put contraceptives on your credit cards, the pro-life movement wants that data. Right, so that's an extreme example, but almost all purchases can be statistically associated with some kind of political preferences, and somebody will want to pay money for that. If I want to support my favorite Haitian coffee collective with my coffee consumption data, I should be able to support that civil society group. And I'd say it should apply to medical researchers and faith-based charities and government agencies. I suspect many of us would give our health data to COVID researchers if we thought they would treat it well and do some good with it. But we don't have that. We don't even have that opportunity. There's no infrastructure. There's no infrastructure for that. And right now, so many social media platforms are designed to promote sensational stories, extremist content, conspiracies. They're not designed to promote consensus or you know, modes of agreement. And so it's a significant redesign, but until we get the redesign right, the best data on public life won't be in the public realm.
Right, and I think related to that, you also mentioned expanding the nonprofit rule on data. So essentially saying certain types of data should not be profited on.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the few rules, as you may know, one of the few rules governing data mining is the rule that you can't, in the U.S., is the rule that you can't profit by selling voter registration files, because those are provided. I think they're actually provided by the post office, but they're provided as a public service. Now, data mining firms will profit by everything else they merge with the data, and of course the data is only. The data is only worth something if it's referential, right, in context. And so these are emergent properties of the data. I think there should be other variables, demographics, maybe some health data that you can't profit from, that do remain in the public realm, that are in the National Library of Congress, and then the National Library in Ottawa, the Library of Congress, and the British Library. There should be a supply of public data about public life available for the public.
Yeah, and I find that your book also, it kind of touches on this tension where I think you say authoritarian regimes or governments writ large want to know everything about you. You know, they want to make their populations legible so that they can control them. But at the same time, you're advocating for us to actually put out more of our data. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about this tension, or how do we balance trust, especially if you say you live in a country where you absolutely do not trust your government.
Yeah, that is a good, tough question. I think it will not be possible to take away Facebook, to undo Twitter, and give up TikTok. We can't extract that information infrastructure. So I think there's some privacy advocates who would say we need to or must, or that's the only solution. I think we've already lost the first privacy battle around that. I think the best thing we can hope for is good public policy oversight that punishes firms that don't do the due diligence to protect data. And I agree with your instinct that people in authoritarian regimes shouldn't be made to give up this data. I'd say that there's, levels of trust for government actually vary from country to country. They're really low in the States, and they're a little higher in Canada, and a little higher in Europe, and higher in Germany, and low in the UK. I think it should be possible. There's enough ideas about how to anonymize data effectively that if a researcher can go through peer review, get millions of pounds or dollars in public science money, or a professional journalist who's passed some accreditation, if you can meet these tests, you've already done more ethics training than any Facebook data scientist has ever done. And I think you should be allowed to play, especially if there's a public good argument to be made.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Trust is really important, and it really differs from country to country. I'm from Canada, so, we say a lot of shit about our politicians, but I think overall we trust our government to an extent, especially when it comes to matters of public health and security.
So I'm curious, do you trust some social media platforms more than others? Or are they all equally?
Oof, that's a tough question. I don't know. I guess trust them on what, right? Do I trust that they won't profit off my data? No, I think that's what they're going to do. I don't know. It really depends. Like, back to which country you're in, there might be, I'm thinking in Malaysia, where, the government is quite authoritarian and likes to censor as many dissidents as possible. People there sometimes do trust social media more than their own government, because it's an alternative avenue that they otherwise would never have had to express themselves. I don't know. Do I trust I don't trust anyone, Phil. It's like, I feel like after doing this for so long, everyone's a suspect. You can't trust anyone. But
so I think I promised a Tinder story earlier.
Oh yes, I want to hear this Tinder story.
So we found a political Tinder bot in the 2019 election in the UK here. Excuse me. The bot would flirt and then talk politics and then talk about Jeremy Corbyn. It was a Corbyn bot. And the only reason we know about it is because the campaign managers who commissioned it thanked their Tinder bot on Twitter and identified the districts where they thought the bot had given them just a few percentage points extra to tip their candidates over the edge. So it was like, the campaign managers felt that made a difference. And it's really hard for us researchers to make strong causal claims about how many tweets cause how many votes to switch, right? We don't have those statistical models. We can say other things about the causal mechanisms, but this Tinder bot was an example where the campaign managers themselves thought there was good evidence of impact.
Yeah, Tinder as a mode for mobilization, I think, is interesting. I know a couple of friends who also use Tinder to get people to vote, which I feel like, I think they're using it incorrectly, but they seem to like that. Yeah, I was wondering also if you could touch on, you talked a little bit about the beginning about thinking of this as a socio-technical system, and how we have to think about not just the technology, but also the social side. And I think that's really important, because I feel like there's a lot of technological determinism at play here. And when people talk about how do we counter disinformation, it always comes with a technical solution. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, there's a couple sections of the book that are the theory sections, and I think I self-identify as a soft technological determinist. So I think of the platforms as providing capacities and constraints. I do think that they enable some kinds of action, right, by design, and then cut other things off. So operationally, what that means is that when when you get your social media feed in the morning, you're not seeing all the content from everybody in your social network. You're seeing something that's curated, but your ability to shape the curation is actually pretty limited. And some Facebook engineers would say that they can't explain the mode of curation because there's so many factors involved. I think we can have a separate debate over whether you can, on algorithmic explainability. But for the most part, I do think that there are organizational causes, social things we could do, right? Improving public civics class, introducing social media training in civics class for kids in high school, higher quality news, diverting some of the revenue from social media firms back into community journalism. Those are organizational things that we can work on. But one of the most proximate, for me, one of the most proximate causes of the problems in public life are when Facebook serves large amounts of misinformation to voters in the 3 days before they vote. And political scientists tell us that most people, most of the time, don't make up their mind actually into those 3 days. Most of the time, we're not using social media to talk about politics. It's other stuff. But in those 3 days before election day, that's when people actually are tuned in, and that's when the delivery mechanism is in place. So I think that whatever the solution is, it has to involve some kind of institutional innovation, but there is that technical fix where the firms have to stop delivering the junk just when we know people are actually paying attention to politics.
Right, yeah. I mean, on that note, we're seeing some questions coming through the Q&A. Josh, do you want me to jump on them, or did you want to handle the Q&A?
Up to you, Gabby. I think there's a lot of good questions that have come in. You're right, both in the chat and Q&A. I think I'll let you handle it, and if needed, I can jump in and recommend something.
Sounds good. I see Robin is active. She's got some questions for us. I think going back to when we were talking about trust, she asks, I'll just read verbatim, can we still trust social media data given bots, fake accounts, and efforts to obfuscate? Which is true, the data is often quite poisoned. So she asks, or will making this data more public improve our ability to understand what data is representative of the public?
I think that there's enough of a science behind this that with a little bit more information from the firms, we could understand what is generalizable and trustworthy in the data. Our team actually stopped working on Twitter about a year ago because this question of what is a bot is actually too hard, it has become too hard to study, one. And second thing is that we did a report on misinformation about foreign policy issues targeting NATO military personnel who were on duty overseas. So this is Russian origin misinformation targeted at military service personnel while they're in their duty station. And of course, we found that there was lots, and that it was about Russia's humanitarian assistance in Syria was the bulk of the content. And we did the report, and Twitter came back to us and said that the content we had found actually would not have reached the military personnel because there was an additional internal spam filter that prevented junk from reaching social media accounts. But the Twitter rep wouldn't explain the spam filter, wouldn't go on the record about it, wouldn't say more. And when I asked, well, there's a 1% feed that we play with in the social sciences, and there's this thing called the decahose, right? 10% of all the content, and then there's 100% of the content that if you have the money, you can pay to analyze. I asked them, well, what is the 1% and the 10% and the 100%? And he said he didn't know. And so Twitter, the company itself, doesn't give, for a social scientist, doesn't give enough methodology data, background, to explain what the sample size is. And if it's not a random 1% or 10%, then from our point of view, we'd rather work on Instagram, because the visual, the kids these days are on Instagram and or TikTok, and that's where the science action is.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm trying to, it's hard to do like listen while looking at questions at the same time. Um,
Well, there's some great ones here.
Well, on
Yeah.
TikTok, there seem to be a lot of questions. I mean, I think at least 2 questions on TikTok.
Yeah, Josh, do you want to read the ones about TikTok?
Curious about TikTok and having experience. So TikTok is closed, right? They don't share. We know a little bit about its ownership structure, and about the question of the iOS 14. Gabby, if you have an opinion on this one, I'd be interested in what your opinion is. My understanding is that Apple has become extremely good about the privacy ecology on its phones, but I don't know what that means for TikTok and access, what kinds of content TikTok might have access to.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Actually, if anyone on this call has an idea, feel free to jump in. I feel like we have a lot of other experts on the call here as well. I think Robin would know too.
I would say one thought on this is that one of the problems with the Android system, I believe, is that there are now too many apps that have full, complete permission to access the data that's collected by all the other apps. So many of the most important apps on the phone will take each other's data and share. I believe the iOS system does not allow that cross-app sharing. Now, TikTok may still get location data and a bunch of other stuff from you, but I don't believe TikTok would ever be able to pull from other content from other apps.
Yeah, agreed. I'm also not sure. I use an Android phone and I was like, does it do that? I think you're right. Yeah. So we have a question. Oh God, there's so many good ones. From Julian Wu. How do you differentiate between ideological advocacy driven by foreign states versus true believers? Which is, again, similar to the bot question. It is very hard to tell what's bot, what's not, what's state backed, what's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think so when we count misinformation campaigns, we do have a normative agenda here. So if it's a misinformation campaign launched by a Western government to prevent young women from becoming ISIS brides, we don't call that a misinformation campaign. I mean, in some ways it is, but we don't put it in the category of and there's other campaigns to try to tempt people to move to Syria or join ISIS. So we don't include that kind of work as a state-backed misinformation campaign from a democracy. At the same time, there are other kinds of campaigns that are, I mean, they really push the limits of these definitions. They're about, we found some Russian origin naturopathy, homeopathy campaigns, and they're about wearing copper to protect, to stop arthritis, holistic medicine, Chinese medicine, the virtues of Chinese medicine over Western medicine, and I suppose it could be it's anti-science. It's a form of misinformation, but it really only those sources really only became misinformation when they started putting out COVID-related content. That's when they became much more hardcore. But they're important as structures because at that point they had tens of thousands of loyal followers, right, who were interested in granola and homeopathy, but then started getting messages about how the virus was created in a lab in Colorado. So what counts as misinformation has now evolved, unfortunately, since 2016.
Yeah, it's tricky. One of my pet peeves is seeing reports on, Chinese-backed disinfo ops, and then I look at their data and the methodology. I'm like, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. And I think overestimating or overstating the effects can be sometimes detrimental. Which we got a question from Matthew McIntosh. He asks, could you provide your opinion on how the spread of COVID-19 misinformation from state agencies will negatively affect global information sharing? Which is something I think about too, when we have this tit-for-tat media war going on between China and the US, where each country is expelling each other's journalists, trying to block each other from each other's country, which in my opinion doesn't do much for national security, but only hurts civil society.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit on that.
Well, I'm not sure what the long-term consequence of all this will be, because there's this emerging kind of style to misinformation, I think. The Russian style of misinformation is to develop legends that and work them for years, right? And so they have long histories and multiple profiles, and they look like complex personalities, and they post pictures of flowers and soccer scores and soap operas, and then they start introducing politics, and they've got 10-year histories. The Chinese model seems to be to simply buy 10,000 users, right? They'll buy them quickly, give them all numbers, and map them out onto a social network and get them going. So I think it can be easier for the social media platforms to spot the Chinese government's volume strategy, and it's still much harder to spot the Russian strategy of these long-term profiles. I think one of the long-term consequences is that these news agencies will develop their own audience, right? There'll be people who will treat CGTN as a primary news source. I think both countries have politically active diasporas who might enjoy having content from the homeland, or may generate content for those media outlets. So I don't think we've had a major election in the West in which the Chinese social media presence has been so active. Right? I think it's just been in the last 9 months that they've arrived. I haven't checked what the latest on the status of the deportation of our friend from Huawei out of Vancouver is, but I imagine the next Canadian, if there's another Canadian election, significant election, provincial or otherwise, and she's still under house arrest, I would expect the Chinese automation to be active in that Canadian election.
Yeah, there's a semi-joke that someone from China once told me where people think the Great Wall of China is to keep content from getting into China, but it can also be used to prevent the over billion Chinese people from influencing the rest of the world, which is an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, so we'll see. Josh, you see any other questions?
Yeah, I might use my moderator's prerogative to select a question or two that I think are particularly good. I mean, all these questions are really good, I think. But an anonymous attendee asked, can you speak to the question of manufactured outrage on social media? The implication being that in order to motivate younger social media users to participate in a given cause, social media appeals to emotions such as anger. Is there data to confirm this, or what are the effects on younger users in democracy? And that links into a question asked by Peter, who asked, is it still democracy when someone is publicly punished or even loses his job for his publicly presenting an opinion on social media, even if that opinion is legal but just politically incorrect? So kind of getting at some of these tensions that, at least for someone like me, I've seen loads in the past several weeks on my Twitter and Instagram of a lot of really strong opinions, a lot of shaming. What do you think on all this?
So on that second point, this is how public conversations have degraded. And I don't know, other than saying something like read books and try to have diverse newspapers and don't forward stuff that you haven't actually yourself read. Some of those basic things are the part of the cure to the misinformation. Forgive me, Josh, what was the first question was about?
The first question was the question of manufactured outrage on social media,
right?
And whether especially younger users are falling for emotions and anger.
I think there are some known behavioral effects that we all suffer from, right? The selective exposure, elective affinity, there's various sort of psychological terms for these things, but basically we don't like new information that contradicts or undermines some decision we've made in the past. We look for people who are like us, and we like to hang out with those people and take them more seriously. women respond to men with a deep voice, and men respond to women with a high-pitched voice. And there's a bunch of behavioral things that you can model, that the social media platforms turn into feature sets. And with a process of A/B testing an ad rapidly in real time, you can figure out what message will play best to a young woman, a young man, race, gender, socioeconomic status, all that stuff becomes somewhat formulaic. Now, I totally buy the critique that it's possible to overstate this, right? We are not automata. But on the whole, if misinformation gets concentrated in swing states in the US, or if there's significant stories, there's an interesting survey number from the Pew Internet American Life Project on young people, and the number of people who still think that Hillary Clinton was involved in something in that pizzeria. They're not quite sure what it was, that pizzeria outside DC, the pedophilia ring. It was upwards of 25%, and that skewed in the under 30 crowd. So I do think that young people are growing up with different information habits. There's plenty of good critical thinking that happens, but we as researchers don't really know the trends on most of the platforms that young people are using.
Great. So would you agree with, I was just listening to a podcast by US, I think philosopher or neuroscientist Sam Harris, who sort of said that he thinks there's a systematic silencing of honest conversation and a breakdown in epistemology, or in like, how do you know what you think you know? Would you say that Sam has a valid point there?
I do, although I'd say something different about the epistemology thing. I think the breakdown is in our own ability to identify argumentative fallacies. So in a sense, higher ed has failed because one of the basic things about a liberal education is learning to spot an ad hominem attack, to spot a post hoc, Proctor hoc argumentative form, being able to read an argument and identify what's not logical, what doesn't make sense, what's a non sequitur. All that stuff is not part of the modern education in higher ed. And so we should be able to sit down and read a commentary essay and scratch out the lines that are just nonsensical. But that's really hard work. And not everybody has those skills anymore.
Yeah, it's not only hard, it's also, I think visually it's hard to see. I think about, Washington Post, New York Times. Visually, an op-ed looks like a news article, which often looks like a sponsored piece of content. And so it's, unless you're looking for op-ed, you might not be, sure what you're reading, but people share it as if it's news because it's on the New York Times.
Absolutely. And then Gabby, of course, if some other outlet borrows the New York Times font or uses the BBC colors, and it's something that you and I would call a commentary essay, but it's packaged as news, then that makes it tough. Yeah. And so back to the point of teaching, the social things that need to change, teaching young people to distinguish a commentary essay from professional news reporting is important, and it's getting harder because the amount of stuff that is professional news reporting is on the decline, right?
Yeah. A lot of factors at play. It's complicated stuff.
That's a good summary. Well, I think we'll probably go around 4 more minutes, if that's okay, because our participants haven't yet dropped off, and there's still a lot of questions, and seems to be a lot of interest. There was also a good point earlier on, I thought, made by another anonymous attendee, but who asked, in reference to your blood diamond comment, Phil, at least to the educated population, it's well known that apps like TikTok and hardware from Huawei gather large amount of data, or at least lay the infrastructure to do so. But Huawei is still popular, TikTok even more so. So do you think that labeling hardware and software and social media companies or outlets as invasive or harmful is sufficient to wane demand? And do you think progress is possible with public education alone, or will strong regulation be required?
I think you need the mixed basket, right? You need some regulation. You need to be able to call out those firms, and public understanding will will only get better if we label the firms and if journalists are covering this stuff well, right? And I do think journalists are getting better at covering data issues and surveillance issues, certainly than they were 10, 20 years ago. I would say that we probably need the mix of some public policy oversight and market. You know, we need consumers to choose the services that protect privacy and don't share data with dictators. Probably what that means is the ability to fine, do real fines with teeth. And it's not just fining firms, but I would say it's fining the lobbyists and politicians who pay for this stuff. Because, you know, we've been talking mostly about foreign governments. In the West, it's also regular politicians who will, whose campaign managers will acquire the stuff and develop it. And the big money is always spent in a presidential election year. That's when real innovation happens. And then whatever tricks, you know, Trump and Biden develop will be practiced in Canada, will be practiced in Oz, will be practiced in the UK and in Europe, and the tricks themselves diffuse. So the ability to punish politicians and fine them for bad behavior is key.
Great. Well, I think, Gabby, I'll leave you to ask a final question if you have one, or I'll let both of our excellent panelists give kind of last words or last comments if they have them.
Oof, last comments. I guess I'll bring out this question that Julianne Wu posted. Thoughts on preventing anti-PRC sentiment from turning into anti-Asian sentiment in Western countries. I see this a lot. My parents, who are Chinese, live in Vancouver, see this a lot. I don't know, any final words on that, Phil?
I'm not sure. I think that one is tough because when we started off this conversation about how the technique of polarizing the public has moved from Russia into democracies, and the organizations that tend to do it the most are white supremacists, ultra conservatives, not small c conservatives, ultra conservatives and white supremacists. So I think the battle to make sure that the battle to constrain what state-backed media agencies produce is going to have consequences for racial understanding, and I think that is a unique project in itself in so many of our countries. You know, Black Lives Matter at the moment, the resurgence. One of the good things might be heightened sensitivity, heightened awareness. New language around race that might start to might decouple China and the Chinese government from people from China, or decouple the Russian government from Russians. And I'm guilty of this myself in the sense that I often refer to Russia, but I'm actually referring to the government, and it is the PRC. It's not the Chinese people themselves. Right.
Yeah, agreed. I think for me, I don't know, this is hard to say, but preventing this type of anti-Asian sentiment, I think also comes from the top. Like, we need good leadership and governance and foreign policy, because I think those have big effects, and also how mainstream media covers it. Unfortunately, if we have someone like Trump or any other populist government who actually benefits by playing to their base and playing up the sentiment, I don't know.
Yeah, we found that Trump is one of the most important sources of COVID misinformation in this country. Like operationally, most people get their misinformation about COVID directly.
Yeah, I think I saw you guys put out that report. It was, you were looking at basically cross-checking false claims across a sector of accounts, and it was often politicians or big influencers who had the most sway, which gets to how should Twitter and social media moderate their biggest influencers. How do you balance newsworthiness versus potentially dangerous health misinfo?
Exactly.
Well, lots of questions and a super fascinating conversation. I'd just like to thank all of our attendees and of course our panelists, Dr. Philip Howard and Gabrielle Lim, for a really interesting conversation, really timely, really relevant. and one that has convinced me to read Phil's book for sure, instead of just skimming it. So I'll be doing so shortly. I am under the impression, but can't confirm, that that this video will be recorded and will be uploaded. That's something we'll confirm in an email. And so if that is the case, which I think it is, then do feel free to share this video later with your friends, and of course to check out Phil's book, Lie Machines, and you'll have a discount for doing so. And otherwise, happy afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.